What's up guys, it's Cody here. And since 2017 marks the 10th anniversary for the iPhone, in this video I wanted to go over the top 10 crazy facts that you probably didn't know about the iPhone. Of course, I'm going to save the best one for last. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So before the iPhone even went on sale, Apple was looking for a partner to sell their iPhone through exclusively at launch. So Apple reached out to Verizon Wireless, which at the time was one of the most highly regarded and largest carriers in the US. And Verizon took a look around, saw the iPhone, and thought to themselves, you know what? This deal that Apple's trying to pull right here is not for us. We're gonna take a hard pass. Now, how much do you guys want to bet that they're still regretting that right now? So instead of Apple getting all upset that Verizon wouldn't partner with them, what they did is they looked for another one. And they reached out to Cingular, which is now AT&T. And at the time, Cingular really needed an exclusive smartphone in order to stay competitive. Now, Apple's terms were somewhat stringent. One of those things being that they didn't want the carrier logo on the iPhone. All they wanted was the Apple logo. But Cingular was like, hey, I'm all about it. Let's do this. We need to stay competitive. Let's put the iPhone on this carrier and let's just see where it takes us. And the rest is history, guys. I mean, this was an awesome move for Cingular. They got exclusive rights to sell the iPhone on Cingular and they made a ton of money. So looking back, solid choice, Cingular. So in July of 2016, Apple sold its 1 billionth iPhone. Now, if you guys didn't bat an eye at that and you're just like, oh yeah, 1 billion iPhones, that's pretty cool. Think about how big that number is. 1 billion. Just to kind of grasp that concept, let's think about if you were going to count to 1 billion. On average, let's say you counted one number every single second. How long do you think it would take you to count to 1 billion? You think it'd take a year? 5 years? 10 years? Try 32 years to count to 1 billion. To count to 1 billion, it'd take 32 years. And that's only if you count nonstop. You don't sleep, you don't eat, you have no fun, you're gonna die counting to 1 billion. If you wanna count to 1 billion, you better start now. Now think of 1 billion iPhones and think of how much the average iPhone costs. Probably somewhere between $650 to $700. So yeah, that's a lot of dough. Not to mention, that number is growing every single day because that was back in July of 2016. So they've sold, I don't even know how many since then, a lot. Now, my very first Apple product was the iPhone 4. So let me know what your very first Apple product was in the comments below because I want to check that out. But since my first iPhone was the iPhone 4, I didn't run into this next issue. And that was the very first iPhone, when it was launched, you could not install third-party applications. So in this day and age, that's like blasphemy. But at the time, the iPhone was brand new. Everybody was just really giddy about just having the iPhone and what the iPhone could do in its own original form with the stock applications that it had. It was just really cool, revolutionary even, and third-party applications was an afterthought at the time. It wasn't even until iOS 2.0.1 before the App Store was released and you can actually start to download third-party applications. Now, the very first iPhone actually almost sported a curved glass display. Of course, while you're going through R&D, a lot of designs are thrown around just to, try out and just see what works and what's the most practical design. And the curved glass display was actually something that Apple was heavily looking into, but they ended up having to toss the idea out the window once they realized that the curved glass display was actually going to be too cost prohibitive at the time. And I'll put up a picture right here so you guys can see what the iPhone prototype looked like with that curved glass. And this photo was actually released during that Apple and Samsung trial in 2012. Now, have you guys ever noticed during iPhone ads that the clock is always at the exact same time? It's always at 9:41. Go to the Apple channel and check out the iPhone clock on those advertisements. They're always at 9:41. You think that's a coincidence? Absolutely not. There is a reason behind that. Scott Forstall once explained, and I quote, "We designed the product launch keynotes so that the big reveal of the product happens around 40 minutes into the presentation. When the big image of the product appears on the screen, we want the time shown to be close to the actual time on the audience's watch. But of course, we won't hit 40 minutes exactly. So the next product launch or the next iPhone commercial that you see, check the time, you're gonna see 9:41. Next, let's talk about the components of the iPhone. What do you think the most expensive component in the iPhone 7 is? The display. So how much do you think that display costs? Well, for the iPhone 7, it's actually about $45. And that's the most expensive component on the entire device. Now, if you're talking about like a iPhone 7 Plus, then it's gonna be a little bit higher and closer to about $52. Now, the next most expensive component is the wireless chip. But all of that brings me to my next fact. You're probably asking yourself, well, if the most expensive component of the iPhone 7 is $45, how much does it cost to actually build an iPhone 7 if we're just talking about parts? Well, it's about $219. That's pretty cheap. Now, of course, Apple deserves its profits, and it doesn't take into consideration R&D, design, or assembling the iPhone, but at the same time, 219 bucks. So the very first iPhone team was elite and top secret. So Steve Jobs actually tasked Scott Forstall of building that team. And he really could do whatever he wanted, except there was one rule. You could not hire anybody outside of Apple. So what did Scott Forstall do? He went around to engineers, the very top engineers in Apple, didn't matter what division that they were in, and asked them if they wanted to be part of something big. Now again, this project was top secret. So even when he was interviewing the engineers and recruiting them, he couldn't even tell them what project they were going to be working on. Basically, all he could say was, you're going to have to give up your weekends and you're going to have to work nights a lot. And the engineers that took that chance ended up creating what was at the time and probably still arguably the best phone on the market. Definitely still the best phone on the market in my opinion. Probably a lot of you guys too. Now I'm bringing up Scott Forstall a lot, and you guys might not even know who that is or never heard that name before. And he was actually a major part of getting the iPhone off its feet and getting it a successful launch. But Tim Cook actually fired him, and here's the reason why. So as you guys know, Steve Jobs was rumored to be pretty difficult to work with. And the same thing can be said about Scott Forstall. But not only that, that wasn't the main deciding factor of why Tim Cook fired Scott Forstall. There's actually some pretty good reasons here. Now, Scott Forstall was responsible for iOS, and there were a few features in iOS that had a pretty terrible launch. You guys want to guess what those things were? Well, first, it was Apple Maps. Now, not only was it a terrible launch and it just didn't work very well, it basically plagued the entire application itself. Still to this day, you still hear about people complaining about Apple Maps. I'll still complain about Apple Maps because I used it like a year ago and it literally took me to I was like 6 miles away from my destination and I had the correct address. I mean, that's all that Apple Maps is supposed to do, right? It's GPS. Like, take me to this place. That's all you gotta do. If you can't take me to the right location, I'm not gonna use you, right? Right. So I've been using Google Maps pretty much ever since Google Maps was a thing, just because Apple Maps never worked for me. Now, the second thing with a terrible launch, and almost, I would still say, pretty useless in 90% of the cases which I try to use it. That is Siri. So Scott Forstall demoed Siri at the event and it worked flawlessly. He asked it all the correct questions and it responded intuitively. But then once users actually got it in their hands and tried to use it, same thing with Apple Maps. Miserableness ensued. And last but not least, the release of iOS 5 and iOS 6 just wasn't all that great. They still use the old skeuomorphism look and it just looked dated. I mean, that's why you saw such a huge change in iOS 7 from that old 3D skeuomorphism look with the wood and everything to this flat, very colorful and vibrant iOS 7. So iOS 7 came after Tim Cook fired Scott Forstall, and that's where you saw that massive change. So while we owe a lot to Scott Forstall in the initial release of the iPhone and iOS, he really screwed the pooch on the later versions of iOS that basically still plague iOS to this day. And last but not least, the iPhone was born out of something that wasn't supposed to be a phone at all. So Steve Jobs back in the day actually told the engineering team that he wanted a tablet with a virtual keyboard. And when that engineering team came back to Jobs with a device with multi-touch functionality, Jobs thought, well, we could apply this technology to a phone. Just as Jobs said to Walt Mossberg in an interview, he said that's when Apple, quote unquote, put aside the tablet and we went to work on the phone. And thank God that they did, because it has turned into something that is amazing, and I am just happy to be a part of the Apple community and being able to enjoy Apple products 10 years later. Now, granted, I do make fun of Apple a lot, and I'm going to continue to do so, just because sometimes I don't agree with the decisions that they make, and I think you guys like to hear my opinion, or you wouldn't be watching my videos. So while I will give Apple a hard time sometimes, I still love their products, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. Alright guys, that's all I got for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and hopefully you learned a thing or two about Apple in the process. Alright guys, if you guys want to stay up to date with my videos, be sure you subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.